with more on the Florida banking industry with Tramm Hudson. Now, next thing I want to ask you is a lot of the banks that have received federal money or the so-called bailout money, now all of a sudden the CEOs of the companies are being subject to scrutiny as far as how they behave, whether they fly on private jets, what kind of conventions they have, where they have it. Do you think that that's fair, and is this kind of careful what you wish for? Or?
I think it's probably careful for what you wish for, but I think we have to go back. 6 months ago, September and October, the financial system in our country was precarious. I mean, we were on the verge of collapse. It wasn't so much that consumers didn't know if their money was going to be safe. The banks were distrustful of one another, would not lend each other. They really did not know the values of these different assets. I mean, think about it. You had Wachovia, you had AIG, you had Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, all go out of business in the month of September. And the government in October established a program called TARP, which stands for Troubled Asset Relief Program. And initially they were talking about wanting to buy toxic assets out of these banks. But I think rightly so, Secretary Paulson switched to the idea of investing preferred stock or preferred capital in the banks. Because really that's what was needed, was to shore up the larger banks, particularly with capital, because every dollar of capital equates to about $10 in loans, and we needed to unfreeze the credit markets.
But there's been some talk, I mean, I think Obama mentioned it, that if you receive federal money, now we're going to look at your compensation packages and all that kind of stuff.
And they've done some of that retroactively, too, with the latest approval. But I think that's fair. I mean, I think the government has a certain right to expect things. I think that all the banks had just soon not have the government as their partners. And again, this is not really a bailout. It is an investment in preferred stock into the banks that will yield 5% interest payable quarterly for the first 5 years. And if the banks don't repay it by the end of the 5th year, it jumps to 9%. And I think this, frankly, is the best way for the government to help shore up the banks, because it'll help the banks get through this period. The government will recoup their money and will be able to provide stability for our financial system.
The other thing you hear from the politicians, too, a lot, from a populist angle, is that, okay, we're giving banks money, but it's still hard to get them to lend people money for mortgages, for car loans.
Right.
When are we going to see the connection?
Well, I would contend that banks are lending money. And again, the TARP money is to replenish capital. What banks lend are depositors' money. The capital that is being invested by the federal government in terms of the TARP preferred stock allows the bank to leverage that. Every dollar of capital is worth $10 in loans. And so, I think it's funny when Congress is demanding, what are you doing with the TARP money?
Right.
Thinking that it's to be lent out, they don't understand how banking works or the financial markets work. It's to provide that capital that they can leverage and then...
So it's not just we're giving these banks the bailout money to then lend out to people to buy cars and houses. That's not the way it works.
No, absolutely not. It's to replenish the capital, to allow them to make their bank viable, that depositors will continue to feel safe putting their money there, and then they lend those deposits out. And I would also say that I believe the federal government's doing the right thing, only investing in the very strongest banks. I don't think it does any good to have the federal government prop up weak sisters. Capitalism without failure or bankruptcy is like religion without hell. I mean, there ought to be some consequences to bad decisions. And
did you come up with that on your own?
I stole it from somebody else. But it is pretty good.
That's a good one.
Good. But I will tell you, and this is a little secret in banking, is bank regulators evaluate banks on a scale of 1 to 5, and they use an acronym called CAMEL. C stands for capital, A stands for asset quality, M stands for management, E for earnings, and L for liquidity. And they grade these banks on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being very best. Only the banks that are rated a CAMEL 1 or 2 maybe high threes are eligible for the TARP money.
I see.
And I think that's the way it ought to be. I would venture, we have about 8,000 banks in our country today, and you know, my guesstimate is that we will probably see over 1,000 banks over the next 2 to 3 years either close or be closed or consolidate with the stronger banks, and I think that's good for our country.
How did we get into this mess? How did we get?
I tell you what, it's the old greed, and you know, bankers are somewhat culpable in this, but I think there are a couple of things. I think government policy early on tried to establish home ownership as a noble thing to achieve, going back with the establishment of Fannie Mae back in 1967. The whole idea initially was that Fannie Mae would be a facilitator, if you will, for liquidity to replenish. If banks made loans on homes, Fannie Mae would buy those or guarantee those, and they could be sold in a secondary market. The banks get the cash back, lend it to new people moving to town. And that worked for probably the first 25 or so years. And beginning in the mid-90s, Congress and the executive branch encouraged more and more home ownership. And the problem, the qualified owners of homes was shrinking. And we came up with more exotic products, the interest only, the teaser arms and what have you.
Right.
And everybody thought real estate values would increase. And someone said finally, you know, show me. And you know, we had the Lyre loans, the Alt-A loans, the subprime loans, and it just collapsed.
Became cheaper for people to buy a house than rent an apartment almost.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we got to go to our last break. When we come back, our last bit with Tramm Hudson, and then our Weasel.